Bueno, bienvenidos to another episode of the South Star Classroom, ladies and gentlemen. With us, as always, the beard of knowledge, the DJ to the max, the man who knows more about music than music itself, David Castillo. Brother, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here and talk about the future.
The future, man. That's what we're talking about today. Huge shout out to Jubilee Ransom. We love you, and we are thinking about you. And to our own Dr. Charles Cole, with a real doctor, please stand up. He's traveling across the country doing James Bond things as usual. So it is going to be the three of us, and I want to introduce a frequenting guest to the show, ladies and gentlemen, a man who is so important and so fantastic. We keep inviting him onto the show, and I want him to give a small introduction to himself and where he's from, just to remind our audience who he is. We affectionately call him Lo. His name is Lauren. Lauren, a quick introduction. Welcome back to the show, sir. How are you doing?
Oh, man, it's great to be here. I'm in Seattle. It's a beautiful day today, which we have not had many of in 2024. So feeling good, feeling warm. Introduction myself. I'm a dad to three badass daughters. I've been a part of Big Picture Learning since founding a high school out here in 2005. And I work with schools all over the country.
That is badass. We got a good perspective of what's going on in Seattle. I'm assuming that everything in San Diego is terrible. You got Godzilla showing up to the Pacific Coast. Is that right, David? You got Godzilla over there?
Yeah. No, not Godzilla. But we did have a scare last night. This is interesting. I've always been a big fan of space since I was a small child. You know, like going back to the NASA days and Space Shuttle. Used to follow that pretty closely. And my son is also very much into all things outer space and like rockets and now SpaceX, obviously. So last night we were like sitting in the hot tub doing a wind down, and all of a sudden one of the Starlink rockets is taking off from Vandenberg Air Force in Southern California, north of LA, and they take off in different directions depending on where they're deploying the satellites. And this one went up and it came straight south over LA, over San Diego. We saw the whole thing in the sky. It was incredible. We didn't know what it was at first. We totally freaked out, but figured out very quickly that it was a SpaceX rocket. And we actually saw the booster fall off of it, and it was kind of tumbling. We could see it pretty clearly, and it looked like it was going to land like right in the center of Tijuana, Baja California, but it actually landed on that that little ship that they have out there. They have these like little barge ships, and it was actually right off the coast of Tijuana, and it landed successfully. And then the rocket took however many satellites up into space, as Elon Musk is working to control media and communications.
So we can be rest assured that this was not, in fact, Superman.
No, it was. It looked pretty amazing, though. It looked pretty amazing. It was a pretty cool thing to see.
Did it look amazing to my compadres in Tijuana as it landed on their boat?
That would have been probably pretty scary if you didn't have any notice. We don't track because they're going up all the time. And so we had to like double check to make sure that that's what it was. But it was pretty badass to see. We were both like freaking out. We had a moment.
So what you're trying to tell me is that the bombs were bursting in the air and it gave proof through the night.
That's what it felt. It felt like something like that, man.
Tijuana's flag may or may not actually be there anymore. I want to have an interview with that man. Being like, ¿Qué chingados es esto? Estuve tratando de pescar en medio del mar. Like, I want to have that conversation with that fisherman.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time. It wouldn't be the first time that the U.S. has sent rockets into Mexico, but that's for another show, right?
That is for another show, man.
Yeah.
Man, I was listening to this kick-ass podcast. A guy named Danny Sheehan. Bro, I'll send you both the podcast just through text message. I was listening to it this last week. It is without getting into like a huge tirade about, something that's off topic for the show, this guy was involved in like the Watergate case. This guy was involved in the Iran Contra case. This guy has been involved he's basically Harvard's like UFO attorney now, and is involved in the entirety of the disclosure of the UFO stuff, which, I'd love to have a talk about in future shows, how they basically gutted the entire legislation of disclosing the entire like UFO scenario. And he's just been doing the podcast tours and been like, here's everything that's going on. And in the middle of dropping all this incredible knowledge, concerning the Vatican and the Jesuit arm in the United States, he just fully discloses the entirety of the JFK assassination on his podcast. And I mean, in insane detail, who is responsible behind it, who funded it, who are the people, with names, with evidence. I mean, it was just like, oh, so right in the middle of discussing UFOs, you just decided to drop casually the entirety of the JFK case. And it's unbelievable. And this guy's like no joke. He's like Harvard undergrad, Harvard Law, Harvard Divinity. This guy has no reason to lie about anything. We'll have to do another show about it. But
yeah,
I want to get to our show today. So I'm sorry I missed our show last week. It sounded badass. I got a chance to listen to it. It was absolutely incredible. And it was like a really cool take in terms of like, hey, Biden did the State of the Nation. Let's do a state of education. And it gave me the kind of idea to be like, yo, if we're going to talk about the state of the education last week, why don't we talk about where the future of education should be? And this is a prompt off of, for our audience, if you've been listening to our shows, which thank you so much for listening, we really appreciate you. We had a really cool show essentially about how the SAT and the ACT is making a huge revival. How MIT and now a ton of other colleges who said we were going to be SAT and ACT blind, we're not going to consider them, they're reversing that decision. And they're straight up saying like, we don't have enough metrics and enough evidence to demonstrate how a child should young adult should get into college, but then evidence that they're going to be successful in college. And I got to tell you, it's a huge reason we got Low on the show is because we have here a man who works for an organization that I'm very, very much aligned with that has an absolute answer into an alternative for the SATs and the ACTs, an absolute answer for what the future of education should look like in all of our schools. And I want to give this man some unprecedented time because he's got to go in like 20-25 minutes. I know he's got another appointment. Do you, or can you stay for the whole show?
I can stay for a bit. I have to pick up my daughters from school, which
he's
is
got to pick up his daughter, ladies and gentlemen. So what I want to do is be quiet and give Low kind of the quick prompt is, Low, SAT and ACTs coming back and colleges are using them. I'd love to hear your hot take on those, but then use that as an introduction for, is there a better way of assessing whether a child is going to be successful both in college and in life?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Oh, okay. One personal thing I didn't tell you yet, Omar, is my oldest daughter got accepted to Highline Big Picture Middle School. So, yeah.
That's the school that you founded, by the way. Correct?
I was part of the team. Yeah. Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah. It's great news for us. I don't know if you've been to fairtest.org, but there's a resurgence from some of the universities, right? But they have a list of, 1,200 schools that are test optional universities, 800 or something that do not require, testing for admission. They also have a lot of great links to articles and articles that they've produced, I think really clearly articulating the limits of SAT and ACT is a predictive test, right? Like from what I understand, the only validity that they've connected to the SAT and ACT is that it predicts 26% of the variation in freshman grades.
Yeah.
That's it.
So that's it.
Right? It doesn't go beyond that, right? It doesn't go beyond freshman year, right? It has a 26% of the variability in freshman grades predictive validity, right? And it over predicts the performance of males and under predicts the performance of females. So gender bias is baked into this. Racial bias is baked into it. I think Fair Test does a great job of articulating the research behind that.
Right on.
Right?
Right. I was just about to say, like, dude, like,
right.
Already we have like a massive prediction of like, okay, this is only going to help freshman year, and then there's like gender and racial bias, but there's more.
Right. And can I read a quote that I pulled from one of their recent articles that they produced?
Of course.
While you're doing that, I'm looking at their site, and so you're saying that the ACT and SAT, they have these kind of built-in biases, right, around gender, around race, and what can you say about students with diverse needs, special education students? What are we seeing there?
I wish I knew. I don't know the research behind that and connecting that, and that's a great and important point. And I know that I'm gonna jump on that as soon as I can. But these questions need to be asked, right? So Robert Schaefer, Fair Test Public Education Director. The SAT remains a more accurate measure of a test taker's family background than of the applicant's capacity to do college level work. No wonder nearly 40% of all four-year colleges and universities in the country are now test optional. They recognize that standardized exam requirements undermine diversity without improving educational quality.
Yeah.
I don't know why we still have it. I mean, not to mention.
I just want to soak that in. Well, dude, like, I think we know why we still have it, right? Like, what really hit the dot for me and in my conspiracy theory is like, this is an awesome testament to a family's financial background, resources, and abilities.
Right.
Can I pay for SAT prep? Is my child middle and upper middle class, therefore guaranteeing an extraordinarily higher vocabulary just from being around like educated parents? Do they have an opportunity to send my child to Kumon Math since they were in the 6th grade to explode the math portion? Like, they're in their lives. It's like, how is this predicting any kind of intelligence or success? It's really just saying, yo, your family got money and resources or what?
Yep.
Right.
I mean, it's, potentially accurate to say that the SAT is a better predictor of privilege than it is of anything else. Yet we're using it as a barrier to admission.
And then, Lo, you and I were talking before the show, just to talk really quickly about the College Board, which, listen, like, I get it. Like, I know folks on the College Board, but it's also a money-making organization. How much money are they making from these exams?
I believe I need to pull something up again, but you can create a free account on GuideStar.org and look up any nonprofit's revenues. And if I recall correctly, the College Board is a $1.8 billion and has a $1.8 billion annual revenue. Billion. Like, where does that put them in the country's list? Right.
I mean, where's that put that on the Austin Powers list of demands? I demand $1.8 billion and sharks with laser beams.
Yeah.
I mean, that's insane. So clearly the College Board has no motivation to stop, right? But is there an alternative? Do colleges and folks within the college and working world have an alternative to say, well, if we're not going to use this test, what can we use instead?
Yeah, yes, and I would say we have an imperative, a moral imperative to do what we're doing, right? Like uplifting some of these other more higher quality, more research-backed criteria for admission. And a few weeks ago, Omar, I think you did an excellent job of naming sharing the non-cognitive competencies. And my understanding of the research in non-cognitive competencies is they are far better predictors of post-high school performance, both in college and post-secondary education and in career, right? They're much better than just about anything else we have access to, right? And they're even better for what the original researcher called non-traditional students. meaning students.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm going to pause this right there, and I'm going to remind us that we are practitioners, like we are in the work, right? And
Yes.
so when we think about language, non-cognitive competencies, define.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think non-cognitive is a misnomer as well. I mean, I'm not the researcher, but to me, they're more metacognitive. But there were 8 things. My understanding is the original researcher was tasked with something that doesn't, has maybe sketchy background, but was tasked with figuring out what actually predicts post high schools or predicts university success. And I'm wondering, like the second half of that sentence to me is, I'm wondering, does that mean you only want to work with students that you don't have to work with? That's a different thing. Anyway, so he tested all these different variables, SAT, GPA, a whole bunch of different like habits of mind, SEL, like lots of different things, and found that there were 8 variables that were the strongest predictors across racial groups, gender groups by socioeconomic status. It's since been replicated in a lot of different environments. And these 8 things, I mean, Omar shared them last time. I don't know if you want me to lean into those a little bit, but they're all implementable in schools. And that's the thing that really struck me about the research is these are things that you can measure. These are things that you can, teach or help facilitate experiences for young people. These are things that we can influence in school. We can't influence mother's education, right? Like as K-12 educators, at least like in the short term, right? Which is a strong predictor of post-high school success. But we can influence whether or not a young person has the availability of a mentor, right? If a young person is connected to a mentor, we can influence if a young person learns how to prefer long-term goals over short-term over short-term, what's the enjoyment, right? Deferred gratification, right? We can influence things, and that's why I think they're really important. If I were to start another school, I would build it first around these 8 things.
So what are these 8 things?
Yeah. And I think there's a slightly predictive, the order slightly matters, but it's not huge. I think it's, they're really important. Positive self-concept, right? Does, as opposed to fixed mindset, right? Does a young person believe they can learn, right? And then like some of the, if it's helpful, some of the ways to influence that are like working with adults and like, stop saying I'm not a math person, right? As a teacher, if you're saying I'm not a math person, you're implying that you either are or you aren't. That's fixed mindset, right? Realistic self-appraisal, right? That's the second one. And these are things that we can influence, right? Realistic self-appraisal in big picture schools, our students exhibit, authentic assessments. They exhibit their progress towards their own learning goals, right? And they get feedback from mentors, from community, from family, from peers, right? And that helps them to develop a realistic self-appraisal. Skill at navigating.
But I want to take a quick step back on the realistic self-appraisal. What I really appreciated about that one is that, like, just to grind it down into like everyday language, it's like you don't have this ludicrous overconfidence about your abilities, and it's like the constant like overestimation of self, and then like you don't deliver on goods, and it's just talking, right? As opposed to I think what happens with a lot of students is, sadly, that significantly lower level of like, I can't do this, I don't have the ability to do this, versus, well, no, like I've got skill sets, I've got grit, it's baked into my DNA for my life circumstances.
Right.
These are the things that I'm good at, but these are the things that I constantly need some level of support with. And having a plan and that realistic self-appraisal of being like, here's what I need to work on, here's what I'm good at, here's how I combine the two, I think is such a cool idea of creating like a navigating plan of self, right? And it screams of like Covey's self, the habits of like highly effective teenagers, the habits of highly effective managers. Like, this one really resonated with me.
Right. Omar, you made me think too, like, can you imagine if you were applying for a job, right? And all you had to do to apply for a job was, give them some sort of test score, right? You're like, we'll get back to you, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like, well,
exactly.
These are the kinds of things we're looking for when we hire folks, right?
Agreed.
Right? But somehow there's when somebody's 18 years old, they submit test scores. When they turn 22, right, that's no longer the case.
Right, unless they're applying to graduate school, in which
Sure.
case it's like, what's your LSAT score? And that's all we're going to look at.
Right.
Versus, here's a really solid critical understanding of who I am and what I'm capable of doing, and does this fit the mold or not? Right. Yeah, I mean, that'd be funny if I like apply to a job and be like, yeah, I got an 82. Like, what? Right. I don't even know what that means. Yeah, I got an 82. It's real good. It's real good. It's rich.
It's not great, but it's real good.
Yeah, exactly. Granted that scores out of 1,000, but I didn't tell them that. It's just an 82. So then moving on, the navigating systems and dealing with discrimination. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, especially systems of racism and depression or oppression, as the research suggests, right? And these things all have, if you dig into the research, they all have rubrics attached to them, like ways they measured them that have been shown to be reliable and valid. And these are things I think we can be bringing into schools, right? And if I remember initially, like in the rubric around navigating systems, right? There's self-advocacy in there. There's knowing your rights, right? There's like, how do you respond to these different things? Do you react in ways that aren't helpful to you? Do you, are you proactive? Like, do you seek advocacy? Do you seek help? And these are all things that we can embed into schools. And I struggle with the word teach, right? I think we can teach the vocabulary around these things. We can teach the importance of these things. And then I think we need to facilitate experiences, right? Getting young people out, talking to each other, right? At my school, we would do these interviews where students would pick one of these non-cognitive competencies and they would interview each other about them, right? And that's where students, on the positive self-concept, that's where students they developed this language of self-bullying, right? And they would lovingly point out to each other when they were self-bullying,
Yeah, that's cool.
Things like, I'm not good at whatever. And students be like, oh, no, you're not good at that yet, right? And, we developed a shared language around that. The, long-range goals, I think, how often, well, let me say this. I've had the experience many times where I've visited a school, right? I'm a stranger at the school. Sat down with a young person, started asking them what they're curious about, what they like to do, what they enjoy. How do they want to be when they're 30? What do they want to be around when they're 30? And so many young people have said, I've never been asked that before. And not specific, but I've never been asked how I want to be after I graduate high school. And I think those are things that we can do. We should do. Start asking, what is your? I was at a school last week, and they had personalized learning plans for each student. And on that learning plan, it asked, like, what is your long-term vision around your like self? I forgot their wording of it, but it's like a long-term vision for like your values, who you want to be around, how you want to be, how you want to feel, where you want to live. They had another section for long-term vision around academic goals and and then another section around long-term vision for career goals, right? And these students from 9th grade, right, from 14, 15, however old you are in 9th grade, are being asked to deepen their understanding of their long-term vision. I think that influences.
Yeah, I mean, dude, because like either it's like, I don't know, like you've been in these conversations and like, Dave, I wish you would chime in as well in terms of like, what do we always hear? It's like, well, like, do you want this car? So like, if you want this car, you're going to learn, like, you got to get into college, and like college is the way to go. And look, like I'm always of the fact that we need to make college absolutely 100% accessible to every single child. And then it's their choice as to whether they go in. But I think it's always, I don't even think the adults in our schools know how to do long-term goal planning. Mm-hmm. So how are we relying on our students understanding long-term goal planning rather than just the consistency of the school system that is so much about short-term? Like you walk into a class and it's 45 minutes, then you jump into the next class and homework's due the next day. And like you go to these like prep schools and these really fancy schools, or thankfully now, like BPL schools, big picture learning schools, and you're having conversations about like, well, what's my internship going to be next year, or next semester? Like where it's not just even what college I'm going to be at. Like I've got this thing that I got due like 12 weeks from now, and I need to kind of plan this one out with my teammates in order to accomplish it, versus just like, oh, I got homework and it's due tomorrow.
Yep.
People in these schools, thankfully, big picture learning schools, which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, our public schools are incredibly run schools across the nation. I think you have a couple of private schools in the network as well, but they are truly like and justice for all kind of schools with like low income kids who desperately need these resources. So these are not like fancy prep schools like Andover and Choate, but they run, in my opinion, the way that I think schools should run, in establishing the norms that I think rich kids get, which is not just the short turnover, but really thinking about like, hey man, like it's not just like, what do you want to be? The conversation is a lot like, who do you want to be? And like, that's nuts. Like, David, do you ever have a conversation in high school or middle school about not just long-term planning, but like who you wanted to be as a person?
No. And I think most of what we see in schools tends to be either like short-term, focusing on, goals from the beginning of the year. Most of it's focused around like, when it's even happening is like around academics and maybe bringing up this grade or bringing up that grade, or focused on making a transition from elementary to middle or middle to high, but never kind of like the long-term, long-range goals that we're talking about here. And it's important. I mean, you have to have short-term, obviously, right? Like tomorrow, but your brain can also process and think short-term and long-term, right? That's how you connect, by having a long-term vision of what you want to be, how you want to be in the world. That helps you and motivates you as you're working through, like, the day to day, right? And the things that you have to accomplish in a day, in a week, in a month, in a school year. So I'm familiar with this framework. We've actually incorporated, pieces of this into the TK8, where I was principal. It was a Montessori school with the focus on arts integration and design thinking. And so we dabbled on some of this, and I know it's a different way of thinking for adults. Getting back to Omar's point, like it requires training, it requires time, right? And especially if you're already running a school that's up and running without that kind of, where people are in that mental space, it can be very challenging, because traditional educators, I think a lot of times are like, what is this stuff? How do you? So my question is, you said, I have one specific question now before we get through the rest of the list. I'm looking at these and I understand them, and then you have to go a little bit deeper and say, you said that there are rubrics that live underneath these. A rubric is a tool that you can use to assess like where somebody is, along a continuum, right? So can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? Because normally what we do is we give a worksheet, we give feedback on what we see, what we hear. Students are given a test and a number comes out. But what does this look like?
This?
I mean, measuring any one of these competencies that we're looking at. Like how specifically are they measured?
Yeah. I can find Sedlacek's website where he has a lot of the instruments he's used. And he has a couple books out there. In the positive self-concept rubric, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. It I think pretty clearly, in my opinion, articulates like, a 1 or whatever the scale was, right? A 1 was uses language like, I'm not good at math. I'm a procrastinator. I'm a blank, like fixed, this is the way I am and the way I always will be, right? Yep. And then there's tools too that educators, for each of these, right? And Big Picture produced a guidebook related to these that have a lot of activities for classrooms, and be happy to share that. Some of the activities for educators, right? Like besides looking at themselves, am I reinforcing this language? Am I saying things like I'm not a math person, right? There's also things you can do to help students Like instead of saying, you know, you did well on this, like, good job, you got an A, right?
Right. Yeah. Which means nothing.
Right. Good job, you must have worked hard.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like focusing on the effort more than the outcome. You know, and that has been research backed. And you talked about the, like, a lot of our stuff is short term, like grade oriented, right? I think a lot of those goals that teachers that end up, you know, in conversations with traditional teachers are based on the teacher's goals, not the student's goals. I want you to behave better in my class, right? So I'm going to coerce you into behaving better, or I'm going to bribe you into behaving better, or I'm going to threaten you into behaving better. That's my goal, not the kid's goal.
Yeah, and then like the kids see through that, because ultimately, like, what's in it for the kid? You know, I feel like I'm talking to my mom, who's been like a lifelong educator. It's like, what's in it for me? And I feel like the kid doesn't know what's in it for them, and this is just like some level of compliance situation with their teacher. Like, what is motivating them to take this on themselves? And I think that's really the intrinsic component of education, is that, like, I don't know, there's like my grad school teacher and mentor, Kamer Seth, always had this line from somebody that said, education is the lighting of the fire and not the filling of a bucket. Right. And it's like, if you're lighting a fire, then the fire must be lit, can be lit by the teacher, but must be kindled and preserved and grown by the child. And if the child has no idea why they're learning things or what the point is, like, this is why you have massive dropout rates. This is why like 7% of low income students, particularly Latinos and Blacks, will graduate from college, right? It's just like, I don't know, man. It's like the age old thing. It's like, well, why the shit am I here? Like, what's it worth? So it has like huge effects. And I agree with them immensely. Have we hit the entire comprehensive list already?
We didn't go through it, but I think that I would love to share a guide. Like, if anybody wants a guidebook, or it's, you know, we can, I can share that with you, Omar. Or,
please.
Yeah, and you know, like, for each of these things, and it's meant to be like, here's some activities that you can consider, right? Here's some things that are, you know, and that are connected to the research. Here's the rubrics; they're in there. And some of this I think you can do in a traditional classroom, and I've done it. Some of it requires bigger structural shifts, like to you know, get students into apprenticeships or internships in high school. You can do that with a couple students as a traditional teacher, you know, like hook them up with people in the community on the, you know, summers, the evenings, weekends, whatever. But to really have it baked into the school day requires some structural shifts and some leadership.
Right. And I think that's really what we talk about, like, and that's kind of the shift. And I know, Lo, you may have to go in a little bit. David, can you share that link over the private chat or whatever that we were just using? Is that like when we talked about on the show that after COVID and during COVID, right, we promised parents jetpacks. We promised the parents things would change. We promised everybody that, like, we were going to move in a different direction. And then COVID came and went. And now all of a sudden we're doing the exact same thing that we used to do. And we haven't changed what the mechanisms and structures of schools were at all. And just kind of said, well, this sucked, but, you know, we're going to claim a mulligan. And the same terrible practices, the same boring instruction, the same disorganization that was going on before COVID has now lasted. And I think why I'm so excited about this is that if you've seen the practices at a BPL school, along with these, like, these cognitive competencies, right? It functions so much more as a place where kids have autonomy, a lot more guidance instead of being talked at, the ability to learn themselves in a really solid, nurturing, and supportive environment. And I'm like, yeah, dude, like, no wonder these kids want to come here. And, you know, it's a testament to what I've been saying a lot on this show recently. What I've been telling our teachers recently is that, like, look, dude, like, kids now have a choice. And their choice is simple. Either I go to this school for 8 hours where I'm, like, yelled at, I'm considered a number. I'm not even considered a human being. Like, we just had interviews for Teacher of the Year today with 3 of our teachers from our 3 campuses, right? And these 3 teachers, without practicing or rehearsing with one another, said the exact same thing, which is, I felt like a number. I felt like I was dismissed. I was an emerging bilingual student and I was shoved in the corner of a classroom. And what's so different about the El Paso Leadership Academy, which is the same thing with Big Picture Learning Schools, is that I'm like, here we consider every single student as a person and build a meaningful relationship with them, and then support them to be self-sustaining learners. And I'm just like, damn, dude, like, who doesn't want to be in a school like that, where like teachers aren't yelling at them all the time, or ignoring them, or treating them with discrimination, or having them do busy work, right? Like, all these fancy schools, dude, what do these kids have? Like, time and autonomy, and the guidance to build them up so that they can be self-sustaining. And I think that's the future of education, in my opinion. Lo, I think, I don't know what your time is, but do you want to give any kind of final comments or anything?
I've got a little bit of time.
Okay.
I'm monitoring the bus stop, so.
Yeah. So the good news is, whenever you need to go, let us know. But the longer that you can stay on, the more. But David, like, you've been an educator your whole life, man. Like, and you probably were doing a lot of these things inside of your campus. Like, how does this resonate with your own practice, and how does this resonate with, like, you know, arguably where I think the future of education should be?
So that's a big question. Wow. I think.
I mean, I asked.
Yeah.
On the show, dude.
Like, you did. Yeah.
By nature, I'm curious.
Well, I will say, I definitely, like, I started out, you know, when I started in education, I had a particular mindset, right? And it was not a mindset that was necessarily based on, you know, this conversation that we're having today. It was a different time. And so over time, my thinking is definitely, like, matured and developed. And then I had kids, and then it changed even more, right? And so you know, the way I'm thinking about this is that, yes, I believe our schools and our school systems need to change. They need to adapt to, you know, modern 2000s thinking. When you look at most of our schools, especially our big schools, they're still structured like they were 100 years ago, right? And there's a whole lot of research out there that says the 50-minute block, the 80-minute block, those all are too long, right? You know, and so there's just not a whole lot of evidence to, like, hold up and support the way that our schooling is currently set up. I also think that, you know, going back to where we started this conversation, I felt like, Les, you made some really good points about these factors that are already in play. Many of them even start before a child is born. That will ultimately be factored into the range of SAT or ACT score that a young person has, right? And that's just wild to think about. You know, it's like we all know what these factors are, right? It's even access to, like, good, you know, pre-K services, education, school, whatever, daycare, whatever you want to call it. And then the quality of the schools that you attend, nutrition, access to healthcare, all of these things, right? And so, you know, when you think about it like that, it makes the idea of having these assessments in place that determine what college you might not get into insanely unfair, right? And essentially, what you're doing is we are repeating a cycle. And we sit back and we say, man, why aren't there more Latinos or African Americans going and graduated from college, right? Why aren't there more special education students or unhoused students, right? The data year over year stays the same, and we know it's gotten worse with COVID. And so it's like these gatekeeping tools that are in place that are designed apparently to do what they are doing very well. Right. And so, I mean, that's what I think about it. And I also think that, you know, obviously, and you work with schools, you work with small schools. I'm sure I know you've all built schools from the ground up, which is really hard. but it's probably easier than going in and trying to do a mindset shift in a big system, right? And so I'm also thinking about like where are the examples of people that made this pivot post COVID, which is right now, right? Especially with the extra money that was on the table, which is going away. You know, and like, are there examples of where, or just period, point blank, are there examples of like large systems where you've seen this kind of, I won't say reform because we can't talk about education reform, this kind of shift? Call it reform. We're going to take back reform.
You've seen this.
Yeah. I think I was this school that I mentioned I was at a couple of weeks ago. Their district is involving them and the community in this reimagining process of this school, and they are the school is going to serve. The vision is the school is serving as a learning lab for the district, right? And I've heard that now recently in 3 or 4 different contexts, right? And that was baked into our school back in 2005 in the vision, and you know, with mixed success. We influenced some things, but it's I'm hearing that, I've heard that language several times recently, and that seems like that's an increase as well. That it's coming up more. It's interesting.
Yeah, man. Yeah, and like, I don't know, leadership wise, there's been a couple of even like school districts that have tried to make some fundamental shifts. It's interesting to see the pushback even from parents about these shifts. So like Long Beach has done some pretty considerable work that I think is actually pretty dope in terms of like, how are we rethinking assessments? How are we rethinking how we're getting students to be prepared for things versus all these conventional methods? And it's funny because like, it's so awesome what they're doing, and then there's like pushback because parents are always being like, well, it worked for me and this is the way it always was, so why are you trying to change this? And it's like, well, you're that small fraction of parent that it worked for. And like, this is a conversation I have with teachers all the time, which is like, well, this is the way I was taught and it worked for me. And I was like, how'd that work for the other 86% of kids who do not go to college next to you? Right. Like, how'd it work for all your class? Like, think back to high school. Any of them with you right now? Like, how many of those kids are like right here with you with like your college degree and your profession? And it's like it never dawned on them. So you're right in one thing, is that like, it really does start from the top in terms of creating the leadership for this, but you've got to be able to build in buy-in, because you're going to have resistance left and right. And I know you've both seen that level of resistance immensely. Like, dude, I have, dude. Like, it's just like, yeah, this is the way it's always been done, and we're going to do it this way. And why fix it if it ain't broken? I'm like, mother, like, it's broke, bro. It's been broke for a long time. Like, this ain't broke for you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So right now we're in the process of applying for high schools for next year for my son, and so this is a very timely like conversation, because what we're looking at is, I mean, we're not seeing this conversation, this type of thinking, this type of like assessment is just not necessarily part of any school's presentation or offering that we're seeing, right? Not to say that elements don't exist. So we're looking at much more, unfortunately, like traditional pieces of information to make our decision: class size, obviously academic test scores, looking at attendance, but breaking everything down too, like to the level of we'll look at suspensions, right? I want to know what the suspension rate is at this school.
Yep.
And then after that, I want to look at what is the subgroup in the school that has the highest suspension rate. Is it African American? Is it Latino? Is it unhoused? Special education? That's what you historically see. We found a school where that's not the case. So that maybe they're doing something different, something right. They've looked at the data and they've made a shift. All that to say is, and I definitely have. It's hard to change a big system, but I think what you're saying is you can actually start small, right? With a tweak in language. Language can open up conversations, open up people to think in different ways, right? So it can even start, in simple ways, and even within a school, maybe a pilot grade, a pilot classroom. Is that correct? Is that how some of this work happens?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it can start small in a variety of ways. Right? It can start small with, we're gonna eradicate "I'm not a math person" from our staff language, right? Under the broader concept, like that's something any school can do, right? And the first time I heard that, I was like, yo, like I want to make sure that I'm never conveying that kind of mindset, right? Like, and whether or not you're in a progressive, innovative, whatever school, you can do that. You can do that at home too, right? Like these, the implications for these are go wherever there are young people, wherever there are people.
We did an interesting thing at Urban Montessori when I was there, with some of the language that we were using as adults, also language that we would use, staff with adult community, and then staff with students, and ultimately students with students. So just around, like kind of call and response, and this is something, when I first heard it, I was like, we'll try it. So we eliminated the use of the word "but," and we said, if somebody says something and you want to refute it by using the word "but," think differently. Substitute that with the word "and." So you're actually building on something, as opposed to like shutting down a conversation or a suggestion. And it was very powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. They do that.
Then I ended up leaving the school.
Was there a butt there?
Yeah, I was just about to say, like, what? I want to leave the school. Dude, that's exactly what they do at the in improv, right? Like Second City, Upright Citizens Brigade. It's like the first thing that they teach in improv is you eliminate buts and always include and it's this like radical perceptive shift. But I think that like those are small things that we don't think about that are so much at the root of growing a child's self-esteem, their ability to believe in themselves, their ability to think through things, and their ability to, and like, I feel really adamant about this because in El Paso specifically, and particularly amongst Latinos, we have something called the pobrecito mentality, right?
Oh yeah.
And pobrecito means like, oh, poor little boy or poor little girl. So pobrecita, poor little girl, pobrecito. And it winds up being this crutch where the teacher in this, it's really kind of a fascinating social paradigm, right? Because it's, what is it? It's like, it's not even symbiotic. It's almost like parasitic, right? In a very weird parlance, the teacher, in saying, oh, this poor kid can't do it for themselves, let me help them, it becomes a dependency, and it becomes like, what is it called? Like mutually dependent people, where the adult is dependent on the child for their own self-worth, because their self-worth is categorized by helping the child. The child is dependent on the adult to help them, so they become dependent on that help. And, ever since I was an educator, ever since I started, I was like, we are eradicating the pobrecito mentality and the pobrecita mentality. We are not feeling sorry for these kids. We are empathizing with their circumstances and empowering them to do the things that they need to do in order to grow. And I think it's these 8 competencies that really hit home, because you've got to be able to replace this ideology with structure. Okay, if we're not doing pobrecito mentality, what are we doing then? And I think that's where these 8 non-cognitive competencies, we have crush. I want to really develop more of these competencies into what we're doing, and is saying, okay, we're not doing that. So what are we doing? We're doing positive self-concept. What's a smart, small way of starting it? Well, let's just stop the buts and see what happens. Let's have, peer interviews with one another. And it's like, yeah, what schools have peer interviews? Like, they're so busy just grilling a bunch of nonsense into like children's brains that they don't even have the time to develop a skill set that's going to make them successful. And ultimately, like, I think in one way, it's because people are like, it's always been done. And honestly, I think in another way, it's conspiratorial to be like, well, like, we need to subjugate some class of kids, so this is the way to subjugate them without having to empower them. And that's where I think like the future of education for me is really about how are we empowering every child to have self-determination to do what they want to do, instead of, I don't know, basically like the Pentaverate, like Mike Myers talked about, the Gettys, the Rothschilds, the Vatican, the Queen, and Colonel Sanders before he went tits up. Basically, these 5 like invisible entities that are controlling everything in the world. It's like, well, let's give a kid the power to choose their destiny versus having adults decide it for them. And with that, guys, we're at the last 10 minutes, so I think we got to jump into kind of our wrap up and final thoughts about our show. Isn't that insane? Damn, man, this thing went quick. So
yeah, it did.
Yeah, David, I want to leave Lo kind of with the opportunity to give final thoughts, and we can kind of model it. You want to get us started?
Yeah. So I thank you for being a guest today. Thank you for coming on, and appreciate the expertise that you bring, not only to our show, but the fact that you're out there working with real life educators and systems leaders, trying to lift up this work. So I'm glad we're able to have you on today, just to hopefully help you to lift up work for others too. The thing I'm thinking about right now, I have these the competencies up again, and my one reflection here is like, in schools we are so stuck on so we have grades. You're in the 3rd grade, you're in the 10th grade, you're in the 12th grade, and there's a curriculum for that grade, right? You can excel in like learning and showing that US history or government or algebra or whatever, or you can kind of struggle like many students do. With the thing about these competencies is, this is kind of where you can start to loosen the grips of this concept of grade level, right? Where students can kind of excel, or kind of like it feels like it's more fluid, right?
Yeah.
Some students can kind of be in a zone of like developing towards becoming competent, and then some students can maybe be way ahead based on where we think an 8th grader might be, right? Exercising these skills. When I see these skills too, correct me if I'm wrong, like this is what I think about when we talk about soft skills.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are like the soft skills that we know are, if you're hiring somebody, and you want to look beyond a number that they may have gotten on a test, like these are the skills that actually really matter, around collaboration, communication, around, all of these things. And so, I'm a believer. I've always been a believer. And now my wonder is like,
a believer or a believer?
Yeah, not a believer. I'm a believer. But yeah, figuring out ways that we can support you and your network to lift this up. Maybe we just come back to this every couple of months, Omar, and just take a different aspect of it to highlight it.
Down.
But yeah, that's what I got to say. And I'm glad that, obviously, Omar, you are the practitioner, on the ground, in the classroom, in the building, doing this work. So it's great to hear both of your perspectives. Thank you.
No, it rocks. And I was really excited. I know we got into the nerdy weeds today, but like we talked a ton on the show about what is going off or what is wrong. And I really wanted to kind of direct today's into like, what is something that's going right? And what should we be doing?
And before we do that, I want to call this out. We have the most viewers now watching live than we've ever had. So
wow.
We had almost 100, and now we're up to 85. So shout out to everybody that is tuning in, regardless of where you're tuning in. Make sure we're live every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern time, with the rerun show re-airing on Fridays at the same time. So thank you everybody for supporting the South Star Classroom. Shout out to our viewers.
Huge shout out. Also, like, shout out to Mama Toya. Thank you for saying hi. The BS3 network. It's awesome. Dude, we have a whole comment section, and like what's badass about our show is that when the comments come in, we can address them in real time. It's like we're having a conversation with the audience. So please like join the chat and share comments, because we're able to not only share your comments on the show, but react to them in real time, because it's It's familial on the show, and that's why we have the show, because it's more of a conversation than anything else. So huge shout out to Lo. Thank you so much for joining us. And my quick take is simple. We want to talk about where education should be going. And this is where I think every school should have a pause and say, yo, man, like, what the hell are we doing? And I know our parents feel us, dude. And I know our kids feel us, like endless testing, endless drilling, endless boredom. And it's just like we're at a stage right now where a kid can choose to either stay home and do some, like, I think I said the word bumba clot last time I was on the show, which, by the way, like, I grew up in the 90s. I watched a lot of like interesting movies, and it's one of my favorite words. It's a kind of a terrible word, but I enjoy using it a great deal. So much so that a friend sent me a meme with that word, but it's just like dog crap routines in the classroom that are making kids bored. And they have a choice now to say, I can either put up with this, or I could go into this homeschool program where I'm doing, I don't know, a 10th of the work, a 20th of the work. There's no real regulations around homeschool, which we did a whole show about 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
And that's the alternative. They could stay home. They can do that program. So if we're not going to change the way that we do things in the classroom to empower them, to make it fun, to make it exciting, to say, this is something I can't get at home, then teachers, parents, you not only have choices, but that kid has a choice. And if you're a teacher, they don't have to be in your classroom anymore. They got a choice to stay home and do this stuff. They got a choice between other schools who may be doing this stuff. If you're a parent, I would look out for those choices to begin with. Big Picture Learning Schools, El Paso Leadership Academy, these are just two of many examples of places that are redefining what we're doing. And I think it's important for us as a show, as leaders in this community, to say, hey, guess what? There are some of us who took your call, parents, of we were promised jetpacks after COVID very seriously, and have started radically transforming what we're doing inside of our schools to make it significantly more impactful for your child and give them the proper preparation to succeed in life. All right, Lo, you get to send us out with your final comments, brother.
Well, lots of gratitude to be here. Thank you. And Omar, I love the El Paso Leadership Academy. It's beautiful places, just so much culture of belonging, a culture of love. I feel like people are really seen and valued and held. There's one so much in my head right now, but I think that, some people are doing some work to marry non-cognitive competencies with competencies, academic competencies. And I think that's where the future is. And, Big Picture Australia was working with the University of Melbourne, developed this credential called the IBPLC, International Big Picture Learning Credential. Oh, Alexa, stop. And it marries the real valid, there was worked with a researcher at University of Melbourne. What academics are actually valid predictors, right? What academic skills are valid predictors of post high school success? Combine that with the non-cognitive competencies. And then the one piece I would add is help students think about their purpose and their long-term vision. And that's what I think we should be aiming toward.
I mean, I was on mute. I'm sitting here talking to myself as usual. I love the fact that we have a shared vision about, I think, what should be happening for kids to give them the ability to manifest their own destiny moving forward. So that's our time, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Beard of Knowledge, Mr. David Castillo, on behalf of Lauren, pronounce your last name for us.
Demarudis.
Demarudis, man. Yeah, he's Greek. I'm Lebanese, man. We're going to let our Greek flag fly. And me, Omar Yanad, on behalf of the South Star Classroom and Jubilee and our famed Dr. Charles Cole, thank you so much for tuning in. 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific every single Tuesday. We'll see you online, and we'll see you next week. Peace.